Hey everybody, this is Brad Dyke reaching out to you to say hi. How you doing? This video is going to be a segue away. It's going to be about hardware, but it's going to be a little bit different in the hardware sense, as in we're going to be talking to what you see here in the background, because I had a really great response about some ideas about other things to talk to, and people were really interested. You know, how do you manage? How do you work? What's your growth aspects of working with two racks? Actually, it's four racks to be exact. Just two are here and the others are in other locations within my home. But the overall goal is, of course, that, you know, they were interested to say, hey, can you explain your setup, how you have things running, and so on and so on. So I said, sure, not a problem. I can do that. So that's what this video is going to be about. It's going to be talking about the lab environment. How do I do logic calls, and so on and so on, and how do I work virtually versus physically, and when do I have to do certain things, and how do I deal with diagnostic situations where I have to flip a switch and directly, I don't know, connect to a Raspberry Pi or something. So that's what we're going to talk to here. So give me a second while I reposition the camera so that we can start this, all right? Okay, so this first starts with what I call a Diagnostic i7 console here, and that is basically a secured system on the sideline that allows me to interact with a support office, as you can see here, including the ability to print and so on. So it's basically an office. And in this lab environment, I have what's called the build bench, or the diagnostic bench. I've done many videos on this bench with all of you, a couple of hundred. And I have what's called a three-set style monitor display, which is basically designed to give me as many interface possible connections as I can do it, from 8, 4K, VGA, DVI, and so on. That way I can be able to connect to the plethora of different platforms, as you can see here. May they be, you know, old school, you know, with a 15-pin output, or DVI, which is what this looks like here. I'll go in here and zoom in a little bit, and so on. So this is the critical environment for diagnosing and doing things and taking them apart and putting them back together. And this bench is fully grounded, and as you can see here, is fully loaded with a lot of support equipment. And I have my cleaning PCB board setups over here, and this allows me to do most of my work that I need to do. Now, this giant screen up here is also another monitor. For instance, when I do Raspberry Pis, I actually use this guy to connect with this big monitor here, because it's a little easier at distance when you're looking at it, and it's actually closer to the Pi clusters, which are right over here, when I have to do what's called direct line of connection configurations. And that's rare. Once you get them going and you set the images up, you can actually just stick in the SD cards and boom, you're up and running and everything's good to go. Down here is the master KVM switch, and I'm going to power it up now because I'm going to be bringing up my environment. I've got it off right now, principally so I can talk to you and not have to fight over the noises that are created by the system. But this is a KVM environment. And so this right here is my KVM. I have up to 8 physical inputs, which is more than enough for what I need to do, even though I have, you know, quite a few machines here, over 24 systems. I only really need an 8-port interface, which I will go ahead and provide power to. And you should see it come up, and yes, there it is. It is now active. It's the primary switch. You can put multiple switches in, and down there on the floor next to the display screens is my next switch. If I have to, I can just pop this guy out and put in my daisy chain switch assembly and connect it up again. So that's basically it. And that's important because you have to design your KVM into what you think your rack is going to be. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to walk back away from the rack enclosure, and I'm going to show you a 2-set 42U rack enclosure. And what do I mean by 42U? Well, this, as you can see, one is a little higher than the other, but they principally have 42U inputs, or 42-inch output sets, which if you look up here, you will see that it says 42U. Now a 25U is lower. It comes down to about here. It's called a half height rack. My son has one of those, and it comes up to basically 3 feet. And if you look right here, it says 25. And the format of the industry racks are open standard format. Now what does that mean? Well, you got a 42U height, you've got a 19-inch cross section, and this is very important, the depth of the rack enclosure. Now you can get 2 types of racks. You can get what's called a variable short rack, which in other words usually is about like this, comes out to about here. Those are usually telecom style racks and so on, and they'll give you the ability to put something like this in. And as you notice, this rack is shorter. This is a piece. This is an ATX style rack mount, traditional. Down here, you have true native rack inserts platforms, which are much longer, and they go back to the back. So by getting the full depth of the rack setup here and the cross supports, in other words, I got 2 on the front, 2 on the back, I have a variable set in the middle, and I have a variable set in the control rack. Now, which means I could resize this in accordance as I saw fit. And it's from the top to the bottom, and so on and so on. Also, I have here what's called cable management. This is where we flow cabling through these conduits here, and allows us to bundle up and secure wiring platforms. It actually adds native connection points at which you can set up to put like power sources and so on, and that allows you to set up chaining effect. Now in this environment, in this particular rack, I have what's called a traditional server / 10 gig / 1 gig architecture, which if you look here, here's the 1 gig architecture switch with its fiber interfaces right here. And then right here you have a 10 gig loop, which goes back to the master 10 gig switch. And of course we've got the splitters for the 100s. The 100s yet aren't really effective or usable yet at this point stage. We won't talk to that right now. But yeah, you can get 100 gigabit connections and work that out. Now the next thing you have is what's called the framing and the airflow control. Now before you put anything inside your rack, you need to do the math on each piece and know who's the hottest. Right down there is a quad. That's the hottest. He'll make heat, and right next to them, you'll see in the lower sections all the disc arrays. They're also low to the ground. The reason why they're low to the ground is because of what this gray stuff is right here. Concrete. And this is an exterior room of the house that's directly in contact with the ground, which means I have basically a surface area here that is funneling coolness, temperature control, from the surrounding ground of my yard. That means this concrete stays at a constant temperature at all times, and it's a cool temperature at all times. So by placing my hottest BTU outputs, and that's a value you will find on every one of these server designs, no matter how they are, or even how old they are, they'll always say how much BTU output they produce. Like here, I have my cloud router 10 gig switch, and he's my master switch for my internal overall pipeline, and he generates a certain amount of heat, and you can feel it coming out, but it's passive, and that means it's not really a hot type style switching. But if you look below it, and you see the 1 gig switch in this rack, which is right down here, which is a Juniper switch assembly, and it has 10 gig pipes here as well, and 100 gig pipe switch over. And those guys are a little hotter, and they have to have fans, so they're not passive, they're active. And so by understanding the nature of your switches and their heat output, and the servers and the switches and the disk arrays and your heavy hitters like your quad arrays down here, you can then come up pretty quickly with a very clear picture of exactly how much heat is going to be produced. Now in this lab environment, this rack enclosure also has something else in it. It has a urethane style paint on it, and that's designed to try to prevent the metal of the frame from becoming heat sink. It's the one place you don't want heat sink effect to happen. So over here I have an HVAC unit that maintains about 71 degrees in this room at all times, and it supports a 10,000 BTU environment. So it's pretty decent, but it's not perfect. So I have to balance the heat output. And so therefore what I have to do is first I have to place these correctly in order from the hottest on the bottom to the coolest on the top, and make sure that when they are hooked up, that they are hooked up in such a way on their racks to have as little contact metal-wise to the frame of the rack. Now what does that mean? Well, when you use base shelves, let me explain, because some racks, you can take a base shelf. This is a base shelf right here. See that? It's a metal shelf, and you'll see them here for the disc arrays here too, and here as well. These are the beginners of heat sinks. So what happens is this metal frame is just a generic painted frame, so it's completely exposed to heat transfer. It makes contact with the rack enclosure, which is, it's got a polymer on it designed to present a barrier, a resistance to the heat, so it doesn't transfer into the metal of the rack enclosure. But the more you put on these metal shelves, the harder that gets. So up here you see a series of 4070s up here that are in a Proxmox cluster setup, and they basically don't get hot because the heat is above the metal tray. And I did it in such a way so I put a barrier between the units and the metal framing of the shelf so I can keep things cool. Now here I actually allowed this shelf to drop down a little bit to promote air convection. In other words, it's going to come out here heat-wise and not necessarily down here where this makes contact with the frame of the rack. Now this one is a Liebert array rack enclosure. Liebert is a very popular brand for a long time. And they were also over here, this is also considered an HP rack as well. But this is my secondary rack, and it's a little shorter, but it is no different than this 42U here as well, which is also the same kind of setup. And this one is called a right line. And a right line, I don't think really is around like it used to be. Way back in the day, it was quite a vendor, but they, just like everybody else, they evolve, become something else. But they, at that time, created this rack enclosure that is, like you see, with its paired up Liebert / HP rack. There's a little bit more height to it because, unlike, if you look up here, you can see the grate on the ceiling. Well, look over here. You see that up there? That's not grated at all. That's actually active heat transfer fans. So when that's powered up, it really moves the heat out of this enclosure, especially if you have the door frames on it. Now, I can't have the wall frames on these racks because that creates the, what we call the torn effect of heat. And the torn effect of the heat means it's allowed to multiply its degree because the accumulation of heat is greater than the cooler air that comes through the system. And as you can see, I've got fairly big gaps here, and therefore this space right here would have become a very hot zone very quickly. Now, I still do restrict airflow, which you need to do with your racks by using positive invariant restrictions, like I have points of ventilation to promote air convection. Let's see right here. Right here. Why do I do that? Well, because I want to make sure that in support of the HVAC unit I have here, that I'm preventing the larger zones of potential heat convection, in other words, rotating heat paths, from creating themselves. Instead, they're smaller and they can be snagged a lot easier. And over here, I have something similar, except I didn't put the spacers in yet because I'm doing a rebuild at this time. But I have the gaps down here for that very reason. And up here, my gaps are obviously present as well because you can see light through the enclosure. Unlike this big guy right here, he is designed to make sure that heat moves up and up to the ceiling, not, again, allowing heat convection effects to happen within the rack enclosure. So the next thing you've got to consider is what we call management. Now, my environments are constantly being rebuilt. So as you're looking at this environment, you want to be able to flow in your wiring and you want to flow it out. Here you can see my 8 port connections, which are 2 per each bridge connection. And then I have sets of cables and sets of states in place. For instance, like I can put this in here, and this will bring another switch into life. And you can hear it powering up now. That's the Juniper 10 gig switch right down there. And it is powering up. And it's going to be mad at me for a few minutes. It doesn't like being powered up, by the way. That's the weird thing about this particular switch. But the switch allows you to be able to add in and remove your connectivity. Now, granted, if you look there, there's a little bit of a spaghetti mess. It's going to happen. Don't get upset about that. And you know what? The only thing you get out of having a perfectly aligned rack enclosure is a rack enclosure you have to rebuild again. So as you can see here, I adaptively make changes on the fly as I need them, as I bring in and out connectivity based on demand. And that's important because this allows me to be able to have multiple configurations staged here. Because if you look here, I've got mini clusters, I've got pi clusters, I've got independent arrays. Independent arrays means they don't care what they connect to, they just provide storage. They're not even NASes. That's something, it's a little bit of a secret I have in the back of my back pocket that many people don't understand, but these guys are big, but they're also not big. See? So when they run, I get a burst of incredible amount of storage at a very fast transfer rate for the number of disks that are involved. And they can support upper echelon cluster states, lower echelon cluster states, and so on. And you know, if I want to even bridge them over and put them on the network, I can. But it's something that we used to do a lot in the past. We don't do that anymore because the industry's kind of gone away from those kind of protocols. But the overall goal here is to understand the nature of using your rack in a smart way. You can have a pretty rack, which is great. So don't touch it, lock it away, and never go back to it. Do everything virtually if you wanted to, and you can do that now. You can do that with Proxmox or other services very similar to running virtual private network environments and so on, and they're all logically inside. But in here, you have different environments that are so severe in capacity that here you have a 10 gig switch, and all it is dedicated for this side of this one rack, and I only need 4 ports. And it's got the old 720s, it's got the new 730s, and it's got my tried and true. This is the prototype box, which I did a video on. An incredibly awesome box, by the way. It is just so reconfigurable. It's like the transformer of PC industry. But the key thing is, it's still just a basic tower, so it falls short, unlike these guys, which are full-length enclosures, and that's why this rack is so valuable. Now, if you notice here, you have what's called the lockdown here, and you have also a secure lockdown here. These are used to help control and perch different types of shelving and attachments out there that you might want to use. Now, with that being said, you also have distribution panels like this one right here. You have mount sets, and you can also use that bar strap like I showed you to do isolated control. These are all the pies right here. No, I'm sorry. These are the pies right here, and these are the 4070s, and those are those are all i7s, and these are all ARMs based. And if you look right back there, to tell you how compacted this gets, right there are the pies. You see them? And so they're inactive right now because I'm working with a new idea with them that I put a video out talking to. We need a new type of cluster that can allow us to do even more with all of the peripheral resources than just simple CPU compute. So with that, you'll also see I have what's called staging cables. These are mini SAS cables designed to connect storage arrays to servers to give a whole pile of disks as necessary. It sounds like our Juniper switch has finally calmed down, is running normal again. And over here we have compute Proxmox. These are heavy-hitting Proxmox boxes here, along with their 2 paired state platforms. And then down here you've got another one, and then down there you've got the 720 that's still in operations. This one, this is a 730. It's going to replace my TrueNAS platform here, the 720, and I'll retire that box, make it into a Proxmox calculator, And then down there is the god-awful beast. See him down there? Now, one thing I want to show you here that's important is there's also another standard of interface in here that is much smaller. And here they are. There are two of them. One is the 2624, and then up there is the EMC array, even smaller. I'll point that out to you later. They bridge connect here to this guy right here and into the 720. And there's 64 discs involved, including the ones on the back end right here. These two right here. See one right there and one right there. And those are the disk arrays that are actively engaged. So with that, you can see this rack is just highly compatible with that setup. And then right here, you will see one here, and then one here, right here. These are your PDUs. Now, I am not rich, and if you look over here, you will see the PDUs. Now, these are balanced for output based on power output. And then there's one right here as well. You know where I got these? I got these at Harbor Freight, believe it or not. And then I have a line conditioner set that comes directly off this wall. So here you can see my power output model. We have our generic house power here, which does the basic stuff. And then we have here our outputs for cooling. We have our 4 sets of bricks of 20 amps each. That's 40 amps per rack. So each one of these represents 20 amps output, or 15 amps without parity set. So that means basically, unlike an R5 style 15 amp receptacle you get in a house, these are 20 amp rated, so you can get 15 amps out to this guy. And then he'll pop his breaker if he has too much power draw and do its job. Now, if you noticed, I don't have any UPSs here. And that's because of 2 reasons. The first reason is based on the nature of this lab. It is a test lab, and I am not into having the ultimate whatever setup here. I'm into doing the work I need to do and then power it off. Okay, so now what we're going to do is we're going to talk a little bit about the nature of your integration of the rack enclosure. And what you're going to see over here, let me bring this down for you so you can see it, is you have your KVM environment here. This is your active KVM, and you notice it says 0005 server 05. And if I change over to another class unit, it's going to post and give me a status on the unit, and that's, this time it's version 6 or node 0.6. And we're going to see one of these guys power up in just a second. One day. Now, outside of my multiple excuse me, outside of my multiple connections right now, I'm only bringing up one server because heat is an important detail. And here you can see the HP per line coming up, and I'm going to activate my remote for my HVAC, and it's going to begin cooling down the 80 degrees in this room down to a nice pleasant 71 degrees. Now, as this is posting and beginning to come up, you're going to notice that it is going to have the base configurations. Now, this is what I call a server level monitoring station. In other words, I use it to do the virtualized diagnostics, and I'll explain that to you in a little bit more detail. The virtualized diagnostic is where you've got a dedicated system, and in this case a compatible server operating system. Yep, you need them, by the way. They are important. That can work and interact virtually with your other devices, all in a single interface. Why? Because it provides you the ability to be able to interact like you're supposed to when it's a service for your customer base. So, with that being the case, the challenge ends up being that if you don't have a compatible operating system, at a minimum Windows 10, Windows 11, if you're a Microsoft shop, Ubuntu if you're a Linux shop, or a combination of both, You can do that depending on the resources of the box. But in this case, these are DL, let's see, DL360s, D7s. They're pretty flexible, they're pretty powerful, and I can do quite a bit with them, which is nice because why do you have a diagnostic state? Well, to answer that question is very simple. You're not made of money, right? So let's take a look at that. Within your rack enclosure that you've got here, you will notice that your enclosures actually have the ability of being able to connect up. Now in a data center, these connections, they're important because if you look, you can see them and you can understand the value behind them. But the problem and the challenge with that is that to have that work in a specific format, right? In other words, to have that overhead of all those computer screens and keyboards and mice, what a mess, right? But, you know, a KVM is nice, but what if you could do it smarter? Use a KVM to be able to be your interface for any of your systems. But just use one system to virtually integrate to all of the systems. Now, what does that equate to? In a nutshell, it equates to you to have the ability of saving time, money, cable management, and so on. Because if you look down here, you will notice that the cabling is a 16-paired set wire that runs down through these tracks down here, over back behind, and then up to the KVM stack here, which provides USB connectivity to the devices, KVM for video, keyboard, and mouse as well. Which means if you do it right, this guy has the ability of using USB sticks, ISO images, and all of that on top of mouse and keyboard functionality and a video output. So let's go down to that real quick and we'll give you an example of what I mean. So you're going to hear a lot of noises here as I begin to power up the NAS platform, and then you're going to hear a server power up, and then you're going to hear some more service power up, and it's going to quickly get a little noisy. Stand by for just a second. Okay, so now what you're hearing is the beginning of an operation spin up. The beginning of an operation spin up is where you bring up your peripheral interface devices. In this case, anything that's associated to a disk array or a platform array or an independent storage array or a paired storage array. In other words, you got to bring up your shelves, your disk shelves. That one right there is a 3-par. You got to bring them up first, and you got to get your blue lights on them to say, I'm good to go. Now, with that being the case, the next thing I can do, once I've got the blue light, as you can see down here, I'm going to turn on the parent entity. So we're booting that guy up next. And he's going to generate some noise here in a second. And I can't do anything yet because here's the thing. Your enclosure is going to support 3 things primarily. It's going to be supporting the support mechanism that's called your infrastructure, your networking connectivity. It's also going to supply your resource pooling, and that usually is in the term of a series of disk arrays, or a device with disk arrays involved, or many disk arrays with a controller set. That's layer 2. And then you have the compute side. So in this case, that's exactly the model of these racks you're seeing back here. I have my infrastructure, I have my disk capacity way down here on the bottom, and that's my pool of resources, and then I have my compute engines. These guys are powerful, they're more modern, they have a lot of core processors in them, they do all of the compute side, and these are the Proxmox layered environment sets for which we use. So, with that being the case, we will start to bring up compute here shortly. Let's start with this one. And than this one. Now that right there is 100 processors. Basically 2 stacks of 48, roughly. And they've got lots of memory and they've got a lot of resources and so on. But I'm still dead in the water. Now, here comes the virtual diagnostic state. So what do I mean by that? Well, of course, what I could technically do is I can go in and link into these platforms CLI-wise through their console interfaces, and I could basically lock in and set that up in such a way so that I can just check the states. Now that's very cumbersome and not realistic. When you've got your systems developed and deployed and operational, that shouldn't be any problem anymore. What you need to do is you need to go to your run services. So what do I mean by run services? Well, let me show you. Here on this particular Windows Server 2019 platform, I'm going to go and I'm going to launch an instance of a browser, and it's going to allow me to check the state of the NAS platform, which is going to provide storage. Now this is going to allow us to test the interfaces to make sure that everything is coming up. Now the NAS platform, the true NAS platform specifically, takes time. Now what I can do to make sure that I'm okay is I can start clicking through and taking a look at how these systems are running. So here it looks like our initiation is not there yet, and so it needs a little bit more time. But I was able to, using my browser, to log in and hit these point endpoints and see if they're operational yet. And as I bring them up in order, proper sequence, I'll be able to have one pool support the next pool, which supports the next pool. Now obviously the first thing you got to do is your network environment. You got to power that up, as you saw me do. Then you got to bring up your pool resources, which you saw me do, and that's the true NAS platform in this case. And that's coming up now. Yeah, we'll let that go. And check here real quick. Alright, there's our poster child. We'll let that boot up. Okay, so we're having a post cycle, and these systems are going to come online, and I'm using one display all the time, hence the savings, and that is part of my rack setup, by the way. And with that being the case, in time, these systems will come online and will begin to pair up, and I can begin to log in to my different environments. Here we're joining the so now we're in the Proxmox environment, and I am showing the pools are active. I'm showing the Proxmox clusters are active, but let's say I have a problem, right? Okay, so this is where we have a headache. Now is the time when adaptive cabling is crucial. So over here you can see my Raspberry Pis. This is one of my, these are the bastard childs of our environment. So what I do is I want to be able to pre-configure and diagnose those systems as well. So, to do that effectively, you have to do what's called bridging. Now what bridging is, and this is designing of your rack now is discussion. We have what's called a bridge effect, where if you look, and this was designed by a specialist who made a Raspberry Pi model pairing, but if you notice these guys here, so here you will notice that these special interfaces, if you look here, I made these in such a way so that they were supposed to be for RJ45 outputs, and I like the idea of just passing the cable out to the outside, but I like the HDMI to be a more intelligent design because I hate micro SDI. So if you look down here, you'll see this loop cable, and it is HDMI, and it gives me a front port, and this goes back to rack designing. This front port allows me to take an HDMI cable, as you can see here, plug it in, and then I have a splice cable here that provides the ability of, and it's just a $5 item. Let me show you. See, as a male and a male can go in to either end because it's a dual female, and then it plugs up into this port and can allow you to run an HDMI cable all the way over to the big screen TV, which is right here, and that's where you can do diagnostic state. So you can also do the same thing with an external VGA cable on the servers themselves, because I showed you the 15 pin out connector edges on these servers that can run over using a splice. Same kind of setup, a male-male connection for female ports, and that will allow you to bring them to your display screen. Do we do this normally? No, we don't. Why? Well, the truth of the matter is, the reason why we don't do it is because of the reality of the complication of having to go through 20 nodes. That means you're doing one action 35 times 20. So you see how it adds up? It's kind of like how DevOps works. We work to make fewer steps possible, because at the end of the day, you got to do all those steps times how many platforms you have at the end of the day. May it be software coding or anything else. So with that being said, we go back to our diagnostic screen, and we want to take advantage of porting, because by being able to look and test our platforms through the browser as it's supposed to, we want to be able to make sure that we're able to pair up, connect handshake, and make our all-inclusive storage pool access, which is these localized NFS route mounts which we have out there. And so I'm going to check to see the health of our TrueNAS platform, because sometimes it gets grumpy. Yep, it got grumpy. This happens. That's one of the reasons why I'm going to be replacing my 720, is because it's getting a little old, and it has its challenges just like everything else. But I don't want to bring in that pool of resource into the discussion until my pools are actively running. So with that being said, the key detail here is to remember that if you can do everything on a single display screen to track what you're supposed to have working correctly, then this should never be a problem going forward, and this should be your main console within your data center, of course, to do work that you want to do. So with that being the case, when you're working with that environment, you want to make sure that you are able to bring it up effectively in proper stages, diagnose it, troubleshoot it here. Worst case scenario, because you've designed your rack the right way, plug up diagnostically straight up to the analog input or the digital video interface. And that does require some overhead because you've got to have a mouse and keyboard too, by the way. And I have that set up as well. And I can connect to the devices, see what's wrong, and then I'll be able to, without having to touch my environment, I can go right in and I can start diagnosing problems effectively without having to rip it all out and start over. Now, the other key detail here, let me talk to that while this is coming up, is let's talk about prettiness. Now, I'm all about practicality. My wife and I, that's how we were raised. We raised our kids that way, and practicality and feasibility outweigh how things look. But there is value in LEDs, believe it or not. Now, right now I'm in the process of replacing them, but if you look over here, you see that blue hue? Well, that's an LED strip that is strapped around my workbench, and if you notice, there's a blue hue all the way across because I don't need all the lights on because they generate heat, and I use these LED strips, as you can see here, and they generate a blue hue light, or any color light I want, actually, but I use blue because it's not, it's not going to generate much heat, and that helps deal with the nature of working with lighting in the room. You want a little bit of light, and it does help because obviously I have 15,000 luminary in this lab for my poor eyeballs, and that actually, surprisingly, even though they're LEDs, still do make heat, and that means my HVAC down here has got to work harder to make everything work right. But since we're in the process of now finishing up the nature of the diagnostics and the mechanical natures and the power sources and the placements and the rack support mechanisms, here you can begin to see right back there in the back the exchangers that use the HVAC that I have on now that will basically carry over the air circulation process, and it comes across this way, blows across the top here, and then changes and circulates the upper air up high down below. Now, I did this for a reason, because if you look over here, that heat goes all the way across. I have an aluminum style insulation for both RF shielding and for heat reflection to keep it localized, and it comes down here and it sinks to the cool floor. This concrete floor makes a tremendous difference in regards to the cooling process. So the end result is your system is just really just circulating air over, across, let the heat and the cool exchange, and the air drops. Then it goes down to low surface area, is lower temperature quite a bit in the process, comes back over to the HVAC, less difficulty cooling that air to make it go up and be operational. So with that being said, the HVAC and the open enclosures that you see in the rack enclosures, such as right here, allow better air circulation. No, it's not pretty, but pretty is in the eye of the beholder, right? To be truthful, it really is. We don't care. What we do care about is that it's practicality. I can work with it. I can change it. It's still okay. It's not going to be ugly. It's not going to be ultra perfect. It never will be, by the way, for all those out there who believe they need to have the perfect rack, patch panels, and all of that. You're going to be unplugging it. You're going to be plugging them in. You're going to be changing them around. You're going to use different cables and so on, because that's just the nature of this job. We change so much these days, from point A to point B to point Z, that to be on top of your game, you just simply need to make sure that your environment, like back here, can be quickly rebuilt into the next whatever, right? And with that being said, your next goal is to be able to get yourself to a great place, right? And do it as quickly, as effectively as possible, so you can really learn the real job. And that is basically doing what you need to do to get yourself up and running. So with that being the case, and everything's up and running now, we are going to go ahead and bring this particular video to end. This was something that was asked. This is one of those requests I put out there saying, hey, what do you guys want to see next? I hope this helps. The next discussion will be talking about my next strategy of the 100 downhill, and that is to bring a NAS head in at 100 and then pair that as a dual set to two subset Proxmox nodes. So I'm going to have a true NAS running at 100 gigabit with 200 gigs of RAM, and it's going to break out to two Proxmox nodes. And then the Proxmox nodes will actually be split designed so that they can use the secondary port to provide services to the outside world. This is something really cool because by doing NFS mounts on TX100 sucks. TX1000, not great. TX10 gig, decent. TX100 gig, excellent. But it's a poor man's network. And poor man's networks are just that. We deal with and work with what we've got by using what we call the dual 100 gig port outbound card sets that can provide us connectivity. And we're using crossover bridge cables, TX 100 gig crossover cables, which is an experiment by itself, by the way, to see how much true bandwidth we can get going from NIC to NIC, because we will not be using a 100 gig switch to accomplish this. We're doing what's called peer-to-peer connectivity for bandwidth segmentation control. Now with that, you still have a pyramid design, which is part of your infrastructure side of your rack enclosure, and that is your 10 gig infrastructure that runs on the 1 gig pairing connections for all the outbound services that you're going to render through your actual nodes, clusters, and so on to the outside world. It's just you'll have another layer of extremely high performance speed that will be present, and that will give you the ability to get yourself in a really great place, localized. And of course you can put more TX100 connections in. That's the difficult part, because you're going to have to learn how to do what's called adaptive load balancing, not application load balancing. Don't confuse the two. The adaptive load balancing is where you're bringing NICs into a consolidated team, and they segment their bandwidth together to simulate one IP connection. That gives you, full duplex TX100 gig bandwidth, or if you have more than that, it would give you, of course, a faster pipe. But that is for another day. But with that being said, this is Brad Dyke. I'm going to sign off and basically get you guys in a good place and allow you to be able to have a great weekend. You take care, and the next video will be conceptual, and I'll let you go. Bye.